Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We welcome those, of course, who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone here in-house to check cell phones and see that they've been silenced as a last-minute courtesy to our presenters. We, of course, will post the program on the Heritage homepage following our discussion for everyone's future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our program today is Nick Loris. Nick is our Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow, as well as a Senior Policy Analyst in the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. As an economist, he focuses on energy, environment, and regulatory issues, the economic effects of environmental policies and regulations, climate change, energy efficiency, as well as the benefits of a free market to environmental issues. His work has been published in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Times, and the Investor's Business Daily. He is a major contributor also to our blog, The Foundry. Before joining Heritage, he was an associate at the Charles G. Cook Charitable Foundation and also served as an editorial intern at townhall.com. Please join me in welcoming Nick Loris. Nick?
Well, thank you, John, and thank you all for being here today. We've got a great lineup of speakers for such an important topic, and certainly it's a timely discussion. As many of you know, the Obama administration has been quite adamant about saying that low-income families and minority communities are going to be the most impacted by climate change. The problem with that message is they're omitting one small but very critical word with that message. It's the climate change policies that are going to impact low-income and minority communities the most. By victimizing low-income and minority communities with higher energy costs, not just when their electricity bill comes in the mail, but through all the goods and services we pay for, as energy is such a necessary component for our economy. And really, no matter what your stance on climate change is, these regulations, most notably the administration's Clean Power Plan that was finalized a few weeks ago, they won't have any impact on global temperatures, really an impact that's almost too small to measure. So these policies are all cost to the economy, no benefit. And we can see the writing on the wall. I mean, we can look to Europe as exhibits, countries in Europe as exhibits A, B, C, D, and E of what not to do when it comes to climate and energy policy. And in fact, even a few weeks ago, it was our chief environmental regulator who admitted and had some blunt words of reality when it comes to the Clean Power Plan and climate regulations. When talking about the regulations on power plants, she said, and I quote, "We know that low-income minority communities would be hardest hit." And now she tried to downplay this by saying these higher prices would be temporary and offset by investments in energy efficiency and renewable energy. And in the long run, these regulations would save consumers money. And if that would be the case, I'd ask why these companies aren't already making those investments. But that's what our speakers will get into. And so we have a great group of panelists to explain why that's not the case and why low-income and minority communities are going to be so impacted by these regulations. And because we're squeezing 4 speakers into an hour-long panel session here, I'm going to let them do the rest of the talking. But before I introduce them, I'd like to thank Doug Dominich of the Texas Public Policy Foundation for really organizing this event. He did all the legwork and getting the panel together, and TPPF for co-hosting this with the Heritage Foundation. And with that said, let me introduce each of the speakers, and I've condensed their bios a bit because if I read their entire bios, it would fill up the entire hour because it's such a distinguished and respected organizations that they're associated with that it would take the entire hour for me to read them. So I'll introduce all of them right now, and then we'll just run down the lineup. So to my immediate left is the Honorable Kathleen Hartnett-White, a distinguished senior fellow and director of the Armstrong Center for Energy and Environment at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Kathleen directs CE's research and policy development on a range of issues including energy, climate change, air quality, water rights, and waste. In 2007, Kathleen White completed her 6-year term as chairman and commissioner of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, with regulatory jurisdiction over air quality, water rights, and water utilities and waste. TCEQ is the second largest environmental agency in the world after the U.S. EPA. As the final state decision maker, she presided over complex and controversial permitting issues such as coal-fired power plants, ozone controls for Houston's petrochemical complex, climate change, water right permits, and radioactive waste disposal. Prior to Governor Rick Perry's appointment of Kathleen Hartnett-White to TCEQ in 2001, she served on the Texas Water Development Board, the Texas Economic Development Commission, and the Environmental Flow Study Commission. Kathleen is now an officer and a director of the Lower Colorado River Authority, her fifth gubernatorial appointment. She is a distinguished writer and consultant on environmental laws, natural resource policy, private property rights, and ranching history. To her left is Mario H. Lopez, president of the Hispanic Leadership Fund, an advocacy organization dedicated to promoting liberty, opportunity, and prosperity. Lopez has been an involvement in the conservative movement that goes back to his teenage years as a campaign volunteer and as the founder of California's first ever high school chapter of Young Americans for Freedom. More recently, Lopez has garnered extensive experience in media and public relations, political campaigns, and public policy. He has appeared in numerous English and Spanish language print, television, radio, and online outlets, and has contributed written work to several publications. Previously, Lopez was tapped to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives as executive director of the Congressional Hispanic Conference, a group of between 8 and 16 Hispanic and non-Hispanic members of Congress who together promoted legislation and policy that sought to foster Hispanic prosperity through conservative policy and legislation. Lopez previously served on the Hispanic Advisory Board for the Republican National Committee and was a presidential appointee for George W. Bush. Lopez served as Deputy Director for Coalitions and Outreach for the House Republican Conference Chairman J.C. Watts. To his left is Mr. Harry Alford, the President and CEO of the National Black Chamber of Commerce. For these last 20 years, NBCC President, CEO, and co-founder Harry Alford has established himself as perhaps the nation's preeminent champion of African-American business empowerment. From a visionary concept of what blacks need to do to fully seize their place in the economic mainstream, Mr. Alford has built a global organization that has earned a place at the table of the White House and at top levels of corporate America. As the intellectual and spiritual linchpin of NBCC, Mr. Alford has been responsible for opening doors that have led to billions of dollars in new business for black-owned firms throughout the nation. His courage and leadership have been noted by all in the rebuilding of the Gulf Coast in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. His relentless energy and advocacy is helping forge international business opportunities for African Americans and emerging entrepreneurs in Africa, the Caribbean, South America, and the rest of African diaspora. For this work, he was formally named a cultural ambassador by the U.S. State Department. A native of California, Mr. Alford has made his mark at the highest levels of both private and public sectors. The birth and growth of the National Black Chamber of Commerce is consistent with the dynamic growth of African American-owned firms in the United States, the fastest growing segment in the nation per the U.S. Census Bureau. Mr. Alford is award-winning columnist for National Newspapers Publishers Association and consults and speaks on a number of business matters to groups and agencies throughout the nation. And on the end, Dr. Calvin Beisner, founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for Stewardship of Creation. Dr. Beisner is a scholar on the application of Christian worldview, theology and ethics and economics, government, environmental stewardship, and public policy. A professor of interdisciplinary studies at Covenant College from 1992 to 2000 and of historical theology and social ethics at Knox University Seminary from 2000 to 2008, he has taught theology, apologetics, ethics, church history, economics, and other disciplines. He has written 4 books on population, resources, economics, and the environment, 8 other books, contributions to over 30 books, and hundreds of articles. He has testified as an expert witness on the ethics of economics of climate policy before congressional committees and lectured for churches, schools, colleges, seminaries, and conferences around North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. So as you can see, we've got quite a lineup today, and Kathleen, I'll let you kick it off.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good midday to everyone. And I want to thank my colleagues at Heritage, all of them, and many that have been colleagues and friends and mentors for many, many years. And I'm always very proud to be in this building with them. We live at I think, a very odd, to me it's kind of like being dizzy or having vertigo, historic time. That who knows, when we're all long gone, it will take a length of history for someone to summarize what occurred and how it occurred. but we have a crossroads or a intersection or a inflection point, the way people describe these, between two very, very, and I wish I had a different word than powerful, but powerful historic forces. One, I've sort of had the privilege to watch occur at close hand, and that is the magnitude of the energy revolution in oil and natural gas from shale rock. I think it's still, its magnitude and dimensions are still, I think, really not recognized. And the amount of economic opportunity that it provides that has global significance. And it was the accomplishment which makes my heart pound as a proud American, not by big corporations, not by the government, but by mid and small energy companies in a handful of states. Technology revolution. Just to give an example of the kind of promise that holds, and this is one of many. One, the cost of gasoline right now is one that every person almost in the United States enjoys every day. That's because of the supply is so big, it's a glut. The U.S. is now, and in 2013, the Industry Information Administration said the U.S. is the largest producer combined natural gas and oil. Next is Russia, next is Saudi Arabia. A few years ago, it wouldn't even be laughable if somebody predicted there was going to be this is a very new, the dimensions of which are but the opportunities, just two examples that have to do with lifting people out of poverty through solid jobs. A recent study by PricewaterhouseCoopers estimated that there was, only in the last 3 years, $130 billion of new capital invested in expansions or new construction of new petrochemical plants and manufacturing plants. That is, could be, if it works, if all the authorizations are there, et cetera, just that alone, a tremendous stimulus to our economy. So we have this, still uncharted. We've seen some of the incredibly powerful, swift benefits, but the future of that is uncharted. At the same time, we have a very powerful historical force that's a government force, and that is climate policy. I've, so many decades, watched this evolve and the different assessment reports from the official UN science and all that. We are already institutionalizing what was a theory in laws and rules in foreign countries and in this country. It's no longer just an idea. And we're perilously close to something long wanted by advocates of eliminating, supplanting fossil fuels to a global agreement, which might have the shape of something like the so-called Iran deal, where there's unfortunately kind of an effective end run around our Congress. We're a little bit behind Europe, and not all European nations, but the EPA has taken the most aggressive steps. I'm sure perhaps everyone in this room has heard of the EPA's benignly labeled Clean Power Plan, which if it triumphs over the court's review of it, which it will inevitably have, it will change our form of government, that unelected employees at an agency can create what's the net effect of which is whole new law about a topic that the U.S. Congress considered 3 times and ultimately refused to do. We will have a technocracy. And much could be said about, and worth remembering, and there's not time today, but we are so swathed in energy, the amount of energy of which our lifestyles and our work depends upon, that we don't even notice it. But it wouldn't be there unless it was from a source and from a mode of production that could make it affordable and reliable and safe. The Clean Power Plan, per force, would, of course, if the criterion for putting electric current on the grid is carbon content or carbon intensity and not cost and safety, things are going to change, and we have a glimmer of that from Europe. I think it's very important to look at what is not maybe going on, but is going on now, and which I think also can provide some very keen insights to how quickly a prosperous society can start creating a larger and larger group of people who can't afford electricity or who can't afford an efficient, clean source of heating in their home. Germany, who's all regarded as having the most aggressive enacted in law plan to supplant fossil fuel generated electricity by 2050 by 85%. Their electric prices are now 3 times higher than the average U.S. rate. If you look, just Google energy poverty in Germany, you see all these headlines. My favorite by Die Zeit, which is considered a left-leaning newspaper, that Germany's rush to renewables was a fatal blunder with ugly consequences. And by ugly, she means the human impacts. You see reports that different numbers I've seen, but the highest was 800,000 homes in Germany are no longer connected to the electric grid because they can't afford it. If you look a little further, you see that in the renewable energy portfolio about which Germany is very happy, what they're actually using and developing, 40% of it is from wood. And you can find also, this is, don't have to, not obscure research, Germany is now building 10 new coal-fired power plants from lignite coal, which for what it's worth is viewed as the dirtiest burning coal, because they have to have 100% backup of the renewables they put on. You have 2 units of renewable that you want to dispatch to the grid to avoid instability on the grid. You have to have the equivalent of energy from natural gas or coal. And you can't, natural gas is so high because it's imported from Russia that coal is the only option. So they're not reducing CO2, and portions of the population are actually reverting to what are pre-industrial conditions. So far, short some technological breakthrough no one has imagined yet, we are fairly close just through that one EPA rule of really changing things in our country as far as the energy dynamic. And if you look at, there's a constant in all climate policies. From the very beginning of people talking about climate policies, policies for government to enact measures to reduce or eliminate the risk of harmful global warming, there's one constant, and that's an ever bigger centrally controlling government. To allocate energy, since there's all of a sudden, because of the sanctions on it, it perforce becomes, and even in, at this moment in D.C., when everyone is awaiting the visit of Pope Francis, and I, by the way, I'm a lifelong Irish Catholic, a practicing one and proud of it, and even in his encyclical, he talks about as soon as possible that we develop a one world government, and he even has some phrases in it, run by, and the translation may have been a problem, but it actually says in the English translation, functionaries given the authority to impose sanctions. I find that very daunting, and I think a lot of people that there's one constant about climate policies in this country or anywhere else. Is that really the answer to anything? Has history not shown us that economic freedom, where governments are supportive of business, is not the dynamic that changes people's life? We live about 200 years after what people called the Industrial Revolution. People put it at different dates. It's described, its essence described in all kinds of different ways. But one thing, it's the first time human societies productively harness the concentrated, versatile energy in fossil fuels. And it happened to be a time when there were legal institutions emerging that protect the rights of individuals in economic freedom and in their personal liberties. We now live the average lifespan as a world average 3 times longer. I saw some statistics just recently between 1950 and 2013, the world gross economic product per capita had increased from 1950 to 2013 4 times. The population of the world is vastly larger, I think 7 times more people. The United Nations says in the last 50 years, more people were released from real subsistence poverty than in the last 500. And a lot of that has to do with the productivity and the prosperity that the kind of energy in fossil fuels has made possible. And I'll just close. We have major policy questions that this country will answer, whoever is our next president, whatever the constitution of Congress. But nothing is ever black and white, but the opportunity that the energy revolution in shale gives to this country, the amount of jobs that were created in Texas over this, like 2008 till 2014 or something, was without those new jobs created because of the energy revolution, there would be a negative decline. There would be not one new job created without that, that was provided actually by one state. We have that kind of opportunity, and then we have the risk of some very, very dark, what they really are, political policies, which would, if history is any guide, perforce reduce the productivity and the prosperity in this country. And real people, as we see now in Germany and England, would be hurt. Thank you.
Thank you. Mario?
Sure. Thank you, Nick. Thank you to you and Doug for organizing this, and it's just such an honor to be here at the Heritage Foundation, and especially with such a distinguished panel. It's always great to be here, so thank you all for coming. Well, we heard President Obama make a promise. Well, he made a lot of promises, but in terms of energy, he made one simple promise in 2008, that under his philosophy and under enacting his policies, that electricity prices would necessarily skyrocket, quote unquote. Those are his words. A lot of us remember that. And sadly, this is one promise that he's seeking to keep, no matter what the costs, and the costs are significant. The one study, and I believe it was Harry Alford's NBCC study, estimated the annual electricity costs to go up by $565 billion overall. That's just the cost to the consumers. In terms of GDP, we're talking about $366 billion costs in GDP, which makes it one of the costliest regulations in American history. So it really comes in the form of a triple whammy. And I'm talking now in terms of practical effects on everyday people here in this country. We're talking about direct costs to families in terms of increased energy. We're talking about direct costs to businesses, and that the ripple effect of that gets passed on the consumer in two ways. One is increased prices for everything. I can't think of anything that doesn't require energy to produce, or even if it's a service. I mean, you need energy. We need to have the lights on here, right? We need energy for everything in our lives, just about. And so you're talking about prices going up on everything, soap, toothpaste, to clothing, to obviously more luxury items, but here especially we're talking about just normal everyday things that people use in their lives. And then there's the costs in terms of jobs, because these businesses inevitably will pass on those costs, not just in prices, but also they'll look at their bottom line and say, well, I had 100 employees, but now I can only afford to have 90 employees. And so you're talking about massive job losses. And the reason is simple. Hispanics, for example, spend a lot more of their disposable income on energy. It's just, I don't understand the reasons necessarily for it, but, that is the reality that we're dealing with. And so when you reduce the annual income of the individual by hundreds of dollars, then you're going to have an impact, and especially a disproportionate impact on poor people. Bill Gates can afford to see his energy prices go up. And Warren Buffett, he might not mind if his electricity bill doubles. But to my mom, who's a retiree on a pension and on a very fixed budget, and her friends and our family and our neighbors and all that, I mean, that's a real impact that has real world effects on people and their ability to do things, their ability to spend time with their family, their ability to buy gifts for their grandchildren, their ability to take a trip, their ability to spend some time together as a family, maybe out at a restaurant, or any number of things that we do every day in our life. And that's really where our concern comes in, is because These are real people we're talking about. It's the EPA, and I think the Obama administration sometimes forgets that, unfortunately. We have a total, this regulation projected to increase 25% total poverty. In the Hispanic community, it's about the same number, 26%. So you're talking about job losses, you're talking about an increase in poverty, you're talking about things like costing 14,000 more premature deaths than it prevents. We heard President Obama in his announcement of this regulation talk about the impact on, that, as you said, Nick, so eloquently at the beginning, that the poor is going to be impacted more by climate change. But you said it right. The real impact is the policy. And so if you're talking about protecting poor people and lower income people, causing more premature deaths is, I just don't know how else to explain it. It's mind-boggling that they wouldn't see that. It's mind-boggling that they would put such a dangerous political philosophy, frankly, ahead of the interests of real-world people. And then to do it in their name is really just insult to injury. So that's something that we're very concerned about. We talked about the impact on what the repercussions are for these families. So we looked, and there's a survey that asked people, how do you respond to increased energy prices in your household? 24% went without food for at least one day. 37% went without medical or dental care. 19% had someone become sick in their house because their home was too cold during cold winter months. Again, this is just absolutely devastating. And the EPA administrator, again, Nick, you alluded to this, she's completely admitted that this would have a higher impact on poor and minority families. She then used this really vague language to sort of say, but it's okay because we're just going to increase welfare spending and we're going to have, move these families onto government dependency. So that's her answer. Is, yeah, we're going to make more people poor, and this is going to hurt people with lower incomes, but, we'll just have more welfare, so I guess it's kind of okay. That's not okay. We want to see is we want people that are working, that are able to provide for their families, and the fact that they would have something that a lot of us take for granted, just, my electricity bill is $100, it's not fine, pay it. But to a lot of people out there, it's not just pay it. It impacts a lot of what they do, and that's very concerning. I mentioned higher prices and the impact on businesses. Our concern is especially small businesses. Hispanics start small businesses at a rate 3 times that of the general population. So there's a direct correlation there between their costs, their ability to grow and employ more people and create opportunity and prosperity, which is not just beneficial for them, but beneficial for the country as a whole, is severely impacted by this kind of regulation. And again, Harry Alford's NBCC study, which I'm sure he'll talk about a lot, but estimates the cumulative job losses by 2035 to be 12 million for Hispanics. 12 million jobs lost just in that community thanks to this regulation. And finally, Nick also mentioned something else that was very valuable at the beginning, and that's that this regulation doesn't even do what they claim to want to do. So in 85 years, the impact on global temperature is 0.002 of 1 degree. I'm sorry, is it 0.0018? Is that right? Yes. Of 1 degree. So 18 1,000ths of 1 degree. That is the impact that this is going to have over the next 85 years. And it's an amount so small that, it, like Nick said, it's hardly even measurable. So all of this cost for basically nothing. And you have to ask yourself, why is this happening? And it is because of a dangerous ideological agenda that, unfortunately, the Obama administration and the EPA wants to foist on the American people. and the public at large. And fortunately, there are some ways to fight back, and I think we'll be able to talk about that at some point, but states are filing lawsuits. Governors are refusing to submit plans to the EPA, which is a great step, and we hope to see more of that. So I'll stop there and look forward to the Q&A. Pass it on to Harry.
Good afternoon. Is my mic on? Good. Gina McCarthy has, yes, she has admitted to it, that it's going to hurt the poor. But they know this. It's not inadvertent. It's by design. It is sinister. Since Lyndon Baines Johnson started the war on poverty, poverty became a lucrative industry. The poverty industrial complex brings billions and billions of dollars to the pockets of fat cats and the slick and greedy. And you can control their vote. You can control where they live. You can march them each way you want to march them. And then you have the poverty industrial complex. You've got puppets out there who pretend to be their champions, who pretend to going to lead them to the promised land. Booker T. Washington was one of the first black capitalists, my hero. And he explains it this way. Before the NAACP was founded and the Urban League was founded with the sole purpose of trying to destroy Booker T. Washington's philosophy. He said, there's a class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs. Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, et al. This is true, and they hate me. They hate the National Black Chamber of Commerce. Jesse will say hi. Al Sharpton won't say anything. They hate us, and I wear that as a badge of honor because we make billions of dollars for people. We feed children through entrepreneurship. We send people to college through entrepreneurship. When Katrina hit, I had a heart-to-heart moment with President George W. Bush, and he watched my back as we made $3 billion in contracts to our members in 5 years. All the while, Sharpton and Jesse were saying they weren't giving contracts to people. We were busy getting the contracts and working it. Alphonso Jackson, Secretary of HUD, was responsible for $1.5 billion of that money going to black and Hispanic contractors. For that, they tried to put him in jail. He spent his whole lifetime savings protecting his honor and keeping him from going to jail. We should be building statues about him. It is indeed sinister. Now, why do people feel it is their destiny to stay poor, to be hungry, to do wrong, to go and flirt with the other industrial complex, the prison industrial complex? Why do they feel that way? It's their mind is set, and we're trying to free them out of that. That entrepreneurship frees you. This country awards people with money. It makes life better, so why not have money? G. Carter Woodson, a great author, wrote in his book, The Miseducation of the American Negro, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one for his special benefit. His education makes it necessary. And that's what we have. You know, last week we had the Congressional Black Caucus that's been going on for 20-something years. You take an agenda from 15 years ago and compare it to the agenda of last week, It's the same darn thing. They keep having the same events, keep discussing how bad things are, and you can't get a viable law out of 42 or 45 black congresspersons to save your soul. And I work with Bobby Rush, I work with Danny Davis. We do things, but they want me to do it, and don't tell anybody that I'm working with you. Why not? Don't tell anybody. Okay. But that's the mindset that we have. That's the mind. Then you've got the miseducated Negro, black. You've got the hucksters, the poverty pimps. Then you have the progressive party, the progressives. Now, this is the mastermind of the whole thing. And this is their mindset. And William Botcher said it this way: you cannot help the poor by destroying the rich. You cannot strengthen the weak by weakening the strong. You cannot bring about prosperity by discouraging thrift. You cannot lift the wage earner up by pulling the wage payer down. You cannot further the brotherhood of man by inciting class hatred. You cannot build character and courage by taking away people's initiative and independence. You cannot help people permanently by doing for them what they could and should do for themselves. That's perfect, and that's where we are. We have taken it to the road. We had panels in Chicago, Columbus, Ohio, Pittsburgh, and we got state representatives and mayors, black state representatives and black mayors, to understand what's going on. Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson of Gary, Indiana, said it finally hit me when 300 of my citizens lost their jobs due to the EPA shutting down a plant. We've got the Association of African American Mayors fighting against the Clean Power Plan. That's great. And we're picking up the numbers. And as Gandhi would say, first they'll ignore you. And we started the National Black Chamber of Commerce, everybody just giggled. Then they'll laugh at you. Then they will fight you. And baby, they are fighting us right now. Our study on the Clean Power Plan, our deal on the proposed ozone rule, they are fighting us tooth and nail, harassing. They even think they can intimidate us. They follow us around and yell at us. And I just laugh. But after the fight, you win. And we are winning. And we're going to turn this thing around. And piece by piece, just like the cap and trade initiative where we won that, we're going to fight them. The Obama administration right now, this is like 1945, they are in kamikaze mode. They are going nuts, and we'll deal with them. And we're going to end poverty the right way through entrepreneurship and good old American capitalism. Thank you. I have these quotes here if you want to pass them around.
Thank you. Dr. Bison?
Great, thank you. Well, I have a very simple point for you today, that because human material well-being depends heavily on access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy, and because fossil fuels are, and for the foreseeable future, will continue to be our best source of such energy, the demand to reduce our use of fossil fuels, to reduce our CO2 emissions, to reduce man-made global warming, amounts to a demand to reduce human material well-being. The Heritage Foundation is dedicated in part to enhancing human material well-being, and I thank them for making this event possible. Now, I'm going to illustrate my point with 5 simple slides demonstrating the relationship between hydrocarbon fuel use and 3 simple measures of human well-being: infant and child mortality, human life expectancy, and income per capita. The first slide graphs CO2 emissions per person against child mortality in 1940. Each circle represents a country, the sizes indicating relative population, and the colors representing GDP per capita by nation, yellow being high, green upper middle, red lower middle, blue blue low, and colorless not categorized. The higher a circle falls on the scale, the higher the per capita emissions of CO2. And the farther to the right a circle falls, the higher the child mortality rate. In 1940, for the vast majority of the world's people, CO2 emissions clustered under half a ton per capita, and child mortality rates clustered between 200 and 400 deaths by age 5 per 1,000 children born. Higher emissions, lower child mortality rates, and higher income levels clearly correlated. Now, 69 years later, the circles have shifted to the left, showing declining child mortality rates. They have also shifted upward, showing rising CO2 emissions. In 2009, for the vast majority of the world's people, CO2 emissions clustered between 2 and 10 tons per capita. That's 4 to 40 times the 1940 levels. And child mortality rates clustered between 20 and 60 deaths by age 5 per 1,000 children born. That's about 1/3 to 1/20th the 1940 rates. Higher emissions, lower child mortality rates, and higher income levels, again, clearly correlated. Now we're going to compare 1940 and 2009 measures of human life expectancy. Here, the circle's horizontal location represents life expectancy. In 1940, for the vast majority of the world's people, again, CO2 emissions were about under a half a ton per capita, and life expectancy clustered between 25 and 40 years. Now, we want life expectancy to improve, and we'll see that if the circles shift to the right as CO2 emissions rise. And that's what we see. In 2009, for the vast majority of the world's people, CO2 emissions cluster between 2 and 10 tons per capita. Again, that's 4 to 40 times the 1940 levels. And life expectancy now clusters between 65 and 75 years, which is about 60 to 300% higher than in 1940. Higher emissions, higher life expectancy, and income levels clearly correlate. The next slide graphs GDP per capita on the vertical scale as a function of hydrocarbon fuel use on the horizontal scale from 1800 to 2010. If we value human material well-being, we want to see GDP per capita rising, and it does so only as hydrocarbon fuel use also rises. The call to reduce our use of carbon-based fuels is, by implication, a call to reduce our wealth. As of 2010, world GDP per capita was approaching $9,000, about a fifth what it was in the United States at that time. To return to the 1990 level of hydrocarbon fuel use would be to cut world GDP per capita by about 2/5 of that. To return to the 1970 level would be to cut it by about 2/3. Now, according to the IPCC's coupled climate and economic modeling, the world's poorer nations today, measured by per capita income, become the richest of any scenarios at the end of this century and the next under the warmest scenario, i.e. the warmer the world becomes, the richer those poorer nations become. Why does that happen? It happens because the climate models derive the magnitude of warming from the amount of economic growth, and they safely, accurately assume that the economic growth is driven primarily by fossil fuel use. The lower the fossil fuel use, that is, the more successful their policies, the efforts to mitigate warming by reducing CO2 emissions, the lower the economic growth, and vice versa. The higher the fossil fuel use, i.e. the less successful their policies are, the higher the economic growth. In other words, even according to the IPCC's own modeling, assuming high climate sensitivity, which is defined as how much warming comes from added CO2 in the atmosphere, assuming high climate sensitivity, even though empirical observation, by the way, increasingly points to low climate sensitivity, according to their own modeling, fighting global warming does more harm than good as measured by income per capita. Now, why is that important? Because of this simple insight. The wealthier you are, the more different climates in which you can thrive, and the better able you are to survive any extreme weather event. And the corollary is that the poorer you are, the less able you are to thrive in any climate or to survive any severe weather event. Now, these insights yield this implication. Since abundant, affordable, reliable energy promotes wealth, and nuclear and fossil fuels are now, and for the foreseeable future will be, our best source of that energy, those sources enhance human thriving and survival. And human thriving and survival are reduced proportionate to the reduction in our use of those sources. The primitive energy system dominant among the world's poorest 1.3 or so billion people works this way, as it does in sub-Saharan Africa. The average woman there spends 6 to 8 hours per day, leaving her precious little time and bodily energy for other productive activities that might lift herself and her children out of poverty, gathering wood and dung as her primary cooking and heating fuel, smoke from which, by the way, kills about 4 million people a year, mostly women and children, and debilitates hundreds of millions more for varying periods and to varying degrees because of the upper respiratory diseases that it causes. The poor of this world desperately need to replace that primitive energy system with the modern one in which coal, natural gas, and nuclear materials are used to generate clean electricity delivered at scale through grids, not only for cooking and heating, but also for light and refrigeration and automated clothes washing and drying and computing and industry and business and commerce and healthcare, all the things that lift people out of poverty and misery. The campaign to fight global warming by reducing fossil fuel use is, at bottom, a campaign to retain the primitive energy system and its accompanying low incomes and high rates of disease and premature death. It is, in fact, a campaign of anti-humanism. It follows that such a policy should be taken only if its benefits clearly exceed its costs, and that can only be true if the amount of warming caused by our CO2 emissions is very high indeed. The failure of the computer climate models, predicting on average twice the warming actually observed, over 95% of them predicting more warming than observed, indicating that the errors are not random but driven by bias, and none of them predicting the complete absence of statistically significant global warming over the last 18 years and 8 months, shows that the science behind the notion of high climate sensitivity has failed. Therefore, we must not adopt any such policy, whether it be a global agreement on CO2 emissions reductions at Paris at the UN Climate Summit in December, or the Cruel Power Plan, also called the Clean Power Plan. Now, to learn more about that, I invite you to come to the Cornwall Alliance's website and see our petition there. For the sake of the poor, don't fight global warming. And go to YouTube and see our brand new video series starting out. We've got 6 up now. There are 35 in the queue that will go up every Monday, Wednesday, Friday from now to early December. Interviews with a large number of outstanding climate scientists, atmospheric scientists, oceanographers, economists of both development and energy, and theologians, philosophers, ethicists, and so on, making the case for not trying to fight global warming, but instead allowing people to become wealthier through access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy. That wealth enables people to thrive anywhere from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert or the Brazilian rainforest. Poverty means you can't thrive in the greatest tropical paradise. Thank you.
Great.
Well, thank you, each of those, for those great remarks. We have time for questions, so feel free to raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come around so the folks online can listen to your questions. Say your name, affiliation, and please keep your question to a brief question and not a long diatribe. So, any questions? If there aren't, or if there are soon, I'll ask the first one. Two of the things that the Environmental Protection Agency has been saying while shilling for this plan is that, one, we're giving the states a lot of flexibility, so this isn't going to cost that much. And two, the U.S. needs to be a leader, so the rest of the world will follow. How would you guys respond to that?
Could I start?
Sure.
If I'm not being impolite, as a former environmental regulator, the one whose almost entire job was implementing EPA regulations. When I made the early comment about if this rule holds, it changes our form of government. The relation between the federal and the state governments is one of the aspects. EPA puts states in a horrible, horrible position. They either have to violate their own laws to comply with EPA's dictates or force the state legislature to pass laws. That so changes the relationship in the entire history of the Clean Air Act, and there's other issues like health care and that which change that relationship between the federal. But it is forcing the state government, not just the agency regulators like me, forcing the state government to act as if they were employees of EPA to implement a law widely viewed as far beyond federal law and in violation of their own laws. And it's there are, various lists of, what states may or may not do, but it puts states in a horrible position. And I think a lot, from what I've understood, of states see it, there's a pragmatic necessity to try to at least comply with minimum damage to my state. When state governments do that, they enable the overreach of EPA and help, again, institutionalize it in law. And I think it's one of the most heinous factions. EPA does not have the authority to do what they're asking states to do. And so, but they're obligating states under a law that has teeth in it in terms of enforceability. And all the things the European countries have do, our rule of law is really different than theirs. These rules are enforceable under the basic police power, ultimately, of the country. Anyway, just a few comments.
Also, Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe said in a friend of the court brief for one of the lawsuits against the cruel power plan that this is in fact a total attack on the Constitution, that it completely sets aside the federal versus state distinction, the separation of powers and so on in the Constitution as well. So it's clearly, I think, unconstitutional. But besides that, the flexibility for the states is essentially you do it our way, or if you don't, we're going to come in and force our way anyway. So the flexibility is actually quite chimerical.
Lawrence Tribe, just to add on to that, is one of President Obama's mentors and a fairly left-wing professor. So that's, yes, considering that source, that's no small statement that he made. I would say this: the United States does need to be a leader. We need to be the leader. We need to be, but in a different way. I mean, I think we need to be the most prosperous, wealthiest nation that mankind has ever known, with the most opportunity for the most people to lift themselves out of poverty, if that's the situation that they're in, and create opportunity for themselves, their families, their neighbors, and for society as a whole. That's, I think, where we need to be, where we need to show leadership. And that creates innovation and creates technological advances, which in turn then allow us to address some of these issues that may arise from, that's what allows us to sort of have less pollution, if you will, to be able to clean our rivers better, to be able to have cleaner air. It's that prosperity and the effects of the prosperity that allow us to deal with that. That's why, I remember during the Cold War years, there was this political cartoon that I saw that had, where is the environment better? In the West, where it's owned by the greedy capitalist pigs, or in the East, where it's owned by everyone, quote unquote. And it outlined a lot of the problems that the Soviet Union and sort of government-heavy authoritarian states had with having a clean environment, because they did not have the technology, because they did not have the ability, the prosperity, the material wealth to be able to deal with those issues.
We're encouraging the governors to just say no. There is no enforcement mechanism to make them. The Supreme Court has already ruled that the EPA is well out of bounds, well out of hand, and the EPA ignores the Supreme Court. Hopefully, 35 governors aren't going to do it. And I like the saying of Texas A&M. I don't support Texas A&M, but I saw a guy with a Texas A&M shirt on the other day, and it said, "Come and take it." Yeah? That's what the governor should tell the EPA and the White House. And as far as the world goes, I'm on the board of the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which is 34 countries in Africa, their national chamber of commerce. They have put me on the board and have asked the National Black Chamber of Commerce to lead them in empowering Africa. And the key is energy. That is the key. I mean, you've got land that burps oil. You got some of the most precious resources in the world, and I know they haven't even looked for shale. I know there's shale there. But we've got a philanthropist in Paris. Our Paris chapter has brought him to us. He's kind of a benevolent George Soros, a George Soros who's going to go to heaven. And they're willing to put billions of dollars into development of Africa to make Africa brighter. And Secretary of State John F. Kerry had the nerve to go over there and say, look, African nations, in your development, you must be careful not to increase your carbon footprint. Listen, Secretary of State, if 4 out of 5 of these 600 million people do not have electricity, we are going to go crazy and don't give a damn about that carbon footprint until every house in Africa is lit up. Amen. And you build industry that way, and you turn the nation around, and you create peace. There it is.
Those were 4 great answers. Does anyone have any other questions? I think we have time for one more. If not, that was a great way to end it. Anybody else? There's one back here.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest points that's come up out of this, and Mr. Lopez did a great job of talking about it, is the opportunity this creates for future welfare programs and future opportunities to people. And you already see this in the environmental justice movement, and you see it phrased that way over and over and over again, and creating this false narrative. So I wonder, how do you best make people aware that this backdoor effort is going on? Because it seems just astoundingly, it sounds like another one of these conspiracy theories that this isn't happening, but it's actually happening. And even internationally, with this Paris plan coming up, they're talking about billions of dollars of additional U.S. aid to fund energy solutions that don't work. So how do you show people that this is happening and convince them that it's real?
Well, this is a nothing answer that maybe this will stimulate some of the other fine panelists. That's what we're like, to engage in that kind of communication constantly and find all kinds of different ways to be proactive in that outreach and make it not about, I have felt a change in what I do from trying to go through the 1,500-page rules and figuring out exactly what, to take these big, big messages where the facts are not in question and really take it on. I think in others may have a different perspective. I think in the last 30 years that I've worked on those who generally share our moral and political worldview, as was, I think, expressed by all four of us over here. A lot of our policymakers, they'll check the right box on a vote, but they're uncomfortable with these issues. They can be the stakes of the issue are so high right now that fear of being ridiculed by the press or all of that has got to come out. This is a real fundamental time for humanity as far as which of two kinds of directions we take. And I think willingness to show the really dark side, which I call the dark side, of this forever, whether it was the population bomb or it was unsustainable resource use. They kind of moved that was, of course, when Marxism and socialism failed. Then we had these new justifications for expanding the size of the government by the elites. And this one is no different. And I think I'd love to see, and maybe somebody knows in here, I'd like to see a poll on how many Americans support global governance. Is that not an issue that, I mean, I would bet lots that a very strong percentage would be willing to fight to avoid that. And these are the kind of things at issue right now. So I think there needs to be a more, and I say this about my own work, more visceral response than, analytic rigor. But
That's correct. I mean, I think it's, at the end of the day, it's a communication issue, right? I mean, we have to do two things. We have to talk about the impact on real people outside of the Beltway who are living productive lives and trying to do the best that they can for their families and themselves. I think that stressing that, you cannot overstress that enough, right? I mean, I think that, there are a lot of people out there who aren't paying attention to issues like this at a very detailed level. They see headlines, although they read, one story in their local paper, about it. And so being there with the right message, communicating that in a clear, succinct way, I think is very important, because you have to look about the fundamental values. There are a lot of people out there who are gettable, but they just want a clean environment. They just want clean water. They just want clean air. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But that's what I think the other side does so effectively, is they say, oh, this is for the children, or, well, you want clean air, don't you? And this is the only way to do it. Whereas, unfortunately, there are a lot of folks on our side who often just say no. No, that's the wrong bill, or no, that's the wrong policy, or no, but they don't get into the why, and they don't break it down in a way for people like that to understand. I think we have to be passionate about not just the policy, but also the communication part, because that's what people hear out there beyond the Beltway.
Economic empowerment solves everything. It leads to health care. It leads to education. It leads to quality of life. It leads to better management of our environment. It's economic development. It's the money. And that's why God invented money. And I'm going to Paris next week to deal with the power brokers. Going to Accra, Ghana the week after that. Then we have the annual Board of Directors meeting for the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce. And that's a tough one. It's going to be in the Seychelles Islands, the Indian Ocean. But gotta go. And there is where we're going to unveil our initiative on how we're going to empower Africa from north to south, to east to west, and make a revolution, an economic revolution that will drive the guerrillas and the revolutionaries out. People just want to live free and have a quality of life everywhere. There's not a mother or a father who doesn't want the best for his children and grandchildren. And let's show them the way.
And I think for one very brief and simple message that can get this point across, the new petition that we at the Cornwall Alliance have just released called For the Sake of the Poor, Don't Fight Global Warming. It's at cornwallalliance.org/don't fight global warming. No apostrophe in the don't, by the way. cornwallalliance.org/don't fight global warming. That puts it in about 200 words in a very clear and simple way that people, I believe, all over the country and all over the world will be able to understand and embrace. And if we can communicate that message to our policymakers, I think it'll be a very helpful step.
Great, thank you. I think we're out of time, but please join me in thanking our 4 great panelists.